If you're armed at the Glenmont Metro, please shoot me. Make it a headshot. Shoot me in the temple, aiming slightly downwards. I need the bullet to travel the shortest possible distance through my brain before it hits my hippocampus. If I'm lucky, the sensation of the gunshot ripping through my skull will only last a few decades. As awful as it sounds, you'll be doing me an enormous favor. Death by headshot as soon as possible is vastly better than the alternative. My ordeal started over 10,000 years ago, at 10:15 in the morning. I earn extra money by participating in drug trials. I am a so-called, quote, healthy subject, unquote, who takes experimental drugs to help assess the side effects. Once, it was a kidney drug. A few times, it's been something for blood pressure or cholesterol. This morning, they told me the drug I took was a psychoactive substance intended to accelerate brain function. None of the drugs I have tested so far have done anything for me, in a recreational sense. In other words, none of the drugs I've tested has even given me a killer buzz, or mellowed me out, or anything like that. Maybe I've always ended up in the placebo group, but nothing I've tested has affected me at all. Today's drug was different. This shit worked. They gave me the pill at about 10:15 and told me to hang out in the waiting room till they called me back for some tests. Only about 30 minutes, the research assistant told me. I flopped onto the waiting room couch and read a few articles from a copy of Psychology Today that was just sitting on the coffee table. They hadn't called me back by the time I finished Psychology Today, so I picked up a US News and read it cover to cover. Then I read an old Scientific America. What the hell was taking them so long? I sluggishly turned my head at the wall clock. It was only 10:23. I had read all magazines cover to cover in 8 minutes. I remember thinking that it was going to be a long day. I was right. The waiting room had this little bookshelf with some hardcovers on it. When I stood up to walk to the bookshelf, it felt like my legs barely worked. Not that they were weak, they were just slow. I took a full minute to stand up off the couch, and another minute to take 2 steps to the bookshelf. I scanned the old books on the shelf and picked out a copy of Moby Dick. My arms had the same problems as my legs. Just reaching one hand out in front of me to grab the book took a really long time. I actually got bored just waiting for my hand to reach the spine of the book. I slogged back to the couch and collapsed onto it, in a slow-motion fall that reminded me of the low-gravity hops of an astronaut on the moon. I opened Moby Dick, slowly, and began reading. I started with Call Me Ishmael, and got as far as Ahab throwing his pipe into the sea, which was all the way in fucking chapter 30, before they called me back. "How are you feeling?" the research assistant asked me. "I feel slow," I said. "Actually, it's the other way around. Everything seems slow because you're so fast." "But my arms and legs, they're moving in slow motion." "Your body seems like it's moving slow because your brain is so fast. Your brain is running at about 10 or 20 times faster than normal. You're thinking and perceiving reality at an accelerated pace, but your body is still constrained by the laws of biomechanics. Frankly, you're moving much faster than a normal person." She pantomimed in a jogging motion. "But your brain is running much faster now, and even your fast walk seems slow to you." I thought about the slow motion flop onto the couch. Even if my muscles had slowed down, my body would still react to gravity in the same way. But in the waiting room, I even fell in slow motion. Slow muscles wouldn't explain why gravity seemed weaker. My brain was going at warp 10. That's how I managed to read 3 magazines in the first 30 chapters of Moby Dick in 15 minutes. They ran a series of tests on me. The physical tests were fun. They made me juggle 3 balls, then 4, then 6. I had no problems keeping the balls in the air because they seemed to be moving so slowly. It was boring, frankly. waiting for each ball to move through its arc so I could catch it with my slow motion hands and toss it back into the air. They threw Cheerios in the air and I caught them with chopsticks. They dropped a handful of coins and I counted the value before they even hit the ground. The cognitive tests were less fun though, but very illuminating. Finish a 50-word search, 3 seconds. Solve an intricate maze drawn onto a poster-sized piece of paper, 2 seconds. View a slideshow that projected 10 images per second and answered detailed questions about what I saw. 95% correct. They told me that I measured over 250 on the Knopf scale. Apparently that's really deep into superhuman range of thinking speeds. They then sent me home. It'll wear off in a few hours, they said, which will seem like a few days to you. Try to use the residual effects to get some work done. Catch up on work emails while you're still in high speed mode. The ride home was horrible. It was only 3 metro stops, and in real-world time, it only took about 35 minutes. But in my drug-accelerated hypertime, it felt like days. Days. Just walking out of the medical research suite into the elevator took about an hour. I sprinted out of the office, willing to push my legs faster, but the law of biomechanics held me prisoner. As accelerated as my brain was, I could do nothing to make my legs work faster. The huge disconnect between my body and mind made it extremely difficult to judge how and when to slow down, turn or rotate my body. I basically turned into a giant slow-motion spaz. I misjudged my speed and rammed into the wall by the elevator button at a pretty good speed. Even though that I could tell the wall was coming at me, I couldn't make the finger that I had outstretched to hit the elevator button move away fast enough, and I jammed it into the wall, hard. The pain was intense. If my brain had been running at regular speed, it probably would have hurt for only about 30 seconds or so. But in my accelerated state, the pain seemed like it lasted for a half hour, 45 minutes maybe. Even the elevator ride was horrible. It felt like I spent 4 or 5 hours just descending 7 floors, with nothing to look at but the interior of the elevator car. I sprinted to the metro station. I have to admit, this part was definitely the most fun. Even though my body moved at what seemed to be a super slow speed, I could still carefully choose how and where I put my feet, swung my arms, and turned my torso. It only took a block or two getting used to having a brain that ran at 2 times faster than the speed of my body. Then I basically sprint danced the rest of the way, twisting and juking between people on the sidewalk, and dodging moving cars within inches, aka minutes, of clearance. I spent an hour, in my time frame, descending into the subway and running to the platform. Endless tedium waiting the 6 minutes for the Red Line train to arrive. Although there was more to look at the metro platform than inside the elevator, it was still just intensely boring. I should have stolen that copy of Moby Dick. The Red Line train roared into the station in slow motion. The normally high-pitched squeal of the brakes was frequency shifted by my high-speed mind to a long, low tone, like a monotone tuba solo. It was 3 octaves lower than normal. All sound was slowed down to the point of a near inaudible level. Voices were gone, shifted below the threshold of frequency of my hearing. I did manage to hear a screaming baby on the subway car. Her shrieks slowed to a sound of like whale songs. Sharp sounds like car horns and trucks bouncing over potholes were even low. Muddied roars like distant thunder. Back at the research office, I could still hear and communicate with the research staff. Now verbal communication with anyone would be just impossible. The effects of the drugs were still intensifying. I spent what seemed like days on that fucking Red Line train. Days, listening to the whale song of a baby screaming and the tuba solo of the brakes. Where ordinary voices were frequency shifted out of audio range, smells didn't seem to be affected. I never became nose blind to the stench of the train's brakes. I finally got back to my apartment, Sprinting through my open door into the front hall at full speed was like a slow, relaxing drift down a lazy river. I was relieved to be at home. At least, I had stuff I could do there. I picked up the book I was reading, 100 Years of Solitude, and finished it. Despite turning the pages so quickly I tore them, it seemed like most of the time I spent reading the books was spent turning the pages slowly and not actually reading. 3 minutes had passed since I got home. I tried surfing the internet. My God, it takes long for computers to boot these days. But it was so frustratingly slow, hours, seemingly, to load a new page, and a fraction of a second to read it. 100 articles in my newsfeed read, and just 3 more minutes done. I dipped into my pile of yet-to-read books and finished 2 more. 4 more minutes had passed. I decided to try and sleep off the remaining effects of the drug. Unfortunately, whatever part of my mind is responsible for perception, the part that's been accelerated to hyperspeeds by the drugs isn't the same part that governs sleep. Despite being awake for what I perceived as days, my physical brain still thought it was only 1:25 p.m. It was not ready for sleep. Nevertheless, I tried to sleep. I walked into my bedroom, a slow 45-minute drift into my apartment, and flung myself onto the bed, lazily falling like a feather onto the mattress. I closed my eyes for what felt like hours and hours, 10 minutes of real time. Before giving up, sleep just wouldn't come. I was facing what was going to feel like days or maybe even weeks of being trapped in a slow-motion prison. So, I took an Ambien. The sensation of the pill and the splash of water I used to swallow it sliding down my throat was sickening. A lump that blocked my breathing, moving like a slug down my esophagus. I read a book. 10 minutes had passed. I read another. 18 minutes since I took the Ambien. I threw the book across the room in disgust at my situation. The book slowly pirouetted through the air like a leaf blowing in the breeze. It hit the wall with a long, faint rumble. The only sound I had heard for what seemed like hours, then drifted onto the floor like a flip-flop sinking to a swimming pool. The force of gravity hadn't changed since I took the pill. The laws of physics were the same. It was just my perception at time that had gone wackadoo. This meant I could use the speed of things falling as a way of judging the effects of the drug, based on how long it took for the book to drift to the floor. I estimated the effects of the drug were still intensifying. I read a magazine. I turned on the television. I clearly saw each frame of the video like I was watching some slideshow. Frustrated, I turned the television off. I read some more. The first 2 books of Churchill's History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Not exactly a light read. Frankly, I hated it. But given the hours of tedium it would take to get a different book off of my bookshelf, just sitting on the couch and reading Churchill was better. Or at least, less worse. No ifs, ands, or buts, the sky is blue over Cincinnati. It had now been 35 minutes since I took the Ambien. I laid on the couch and closed my eyes. Time passed. I inhaled, an hours-long process. Time passed. I exhaled for more hours. Sleep would not come. I needed a new plan. I decided to go back to the offices where they gave me the drug. Maybe they would have something to counteract its effects, or at least something that would knock me out until it wore off. I exited my apartment as fast as possible, taking hours in my time frame to do so. I didn't even bother locking the door. It would have taken too long. Down the stairs, it's faster than the elevator if you run. Through the lobby, out the door, onto the street. These few things felt like a long day at the office. Sprinting down the street, dancing and weaving between pedestrians, with what must have looked like superhuman dexterity. Down the first flight of stairs at the metro, across the landing, another hour, and onto the second flight of stairs. That's when the Ambien hit me. The Ambien didn't make me sleepy. Not at all. Instead, it must have had some sort of severe cross-reaction with the experimental drug I took this morning. I was bounding down the second flight of stairs, moving in slow motion, but still making perceptible progress. Then, wham! Everything stopped. The dull roar of the street and the metro noise ceased, replaced by almost perfect silence I have never experienced. My downward motion also seemed to completely freeze. Before the ambient kicked in, my perception of time was maybe a few hundred times slower than real time. After the ambient took effect, time moved thousands of times slower. Every second felt like days to me. Even just moving my eyes to focus on a new point was like an impossibly slow scroll across my visual field. Over the course of the afternoon, I learned how to walk, run, and jump when my mind ran at 100 times faster than normal. But with the 4 or 5 orders of magnitude of slowdown caused by the ambient, body control was almost impossible. I fell on the stairs. Even though I was all but frozen in mid-step, controlling my muscles was impossible. I commanded my foot forward for hours, then backwards for more hours. When it seemed like I would miss the next step, hours of attempting to adjust the angle of my ankle, then readjusting it when it felt wrong. Despite these efforts, I rolled my ankle on the next step. The pain was all but mitigated by the slowness. Hours of increasing strain on my bent ankle. The nerve signals that send pain to my brain must work differently than the nerves in my ear. Sonic energy was spread out over time, diluted until it was imperceptible. Pain flowed into my brain undiluted by the change in my perception of time. Hours and hours of increasing weight on my turned ankle turned into hours of increasing pain upon increasing pain. I pitched forward, my high-speed mind completely unable to control my low-speed body. I drifted downwards for days, managing to rotate my torso enough to keep my head from impacting the ground first. Eventually, I landed on my right shoulder. At first, the impact wasn't even noticeable. Then, I felt a slight pressure on my shoulder as it came in contact with the ground. The pressure grew, bringing increasing pain. For hour upon hour, my shoulder finally gave out, popping out of its socket with an endless sickening tug. I came to a stop days later, crumpled onto the ground, staring at the ceiling. The pain in my shoulder still screaming with the intensity of a fresh violent injury. I had plenty of time to think during the fall. If every second seemed like days to me, then each minute in real-world time would be like years. Even if the drug cleared out of my system in the next 2 or 3 hours, this nightmare would last centuries. By the time I hit the ground, I had a plan. I would get to the platform and throw myself in front of a train. I twisted onto my hands and knees, days of my dislocated shoulder crying for relief. I misjudged the rotation and rolled onto my back again. I tried again, collapsing onto my face as I tried to figure out how to control my body that moved slower than the grass grew. Weeks of effort were finally rewarded with success. I finally stabilized on my hands and knees. If just getting on all fours was difficult, I figured that walking or running was completely out of the question. So, I crawled. I crawled through the metro tunnel. The dumb looks on the faces in the crowd lingered over me for what felt like weeks. I crawled under the turnstile and onto the escalator. The escalator spilled the rush hour crowd onto the platform at the same speed a glacier spills ice into the sea. I looked out over the crowded platform during my indeterminable downward ride. The train status sign suggested that the next train wouldn't arrive for 20 minutes. 20 minutes was like a year to me. I'd have to spend a year on the metro platform, waiting to die. I crawled off the escalator, enduring days of stupid expressions on the commuters' faces. I crawled a few feet to the concrete bench and curled up next to it, just trying to find a position to lessen the pain in my shoulder. Then, my problem with time only got worse. Impossibly worse. The massive slowdown on the stairs was just the beginning of the interaction between the experimental drug and the Ambien. It fully hit me while I was curled up by the bench. I blinked. Years of darkness followed. Sound was gone, and with my blink, sight was gone as well. All that existed was the pain from my fall. My hyper-accelerated mind wasted no time compensating for the lack of sensory input. Voices spoke to me, they sung to me in languages that never existed. Patterns and faces and colors came and went in my mind's eye. I recalled my whole life and imagined living a whole nother one. I forgot English, settled into a profound pit of despair. I spoke to God. I became God. I imagined a new universe and brought it to life with my thoughts. Then, I did it again, and again. My eyes opened with geologic slowness, a faint glow, weeks. A slit of light, weeks. A narrow point of view of the metro platform, the ankles of commuters near me, and an advertisement on the opposite wall. I extracted my phone out of my pocket, a project that spanned decades. How can I even explain the boredom? This pain in my shoulder is nothing compared to the boredom. Every thought I can think, I've thought 100 times already. The view of the ankles and the advertisements never changing. Never. The boredom was so intense it's tangible, like a solid object of metal or stone weighing on my skull. Inescapable. What are my options? If I crawl onto the tracks without an oncoming train crushing me, I won't die. I'll experience even more pain from the 4-foot fall, but I'll most likely be rescued by some do-gooder on the platform and unable to act when the train finally does arrive. My suffering in that scenario will be endless. So, I wait for the train. If I can throw myself under it when it finally hits me, I will experience the pain of being ripped to pieces for centuries, until finally, the light of my life leaves my brain and my experience just ends. I've lived hundreds of lifespans at the foot of this bench. I am far older, in spirit, than any human being who has ever lived. The most of my life experience has been a snapshot of pain huddled on the floor of the subway platform, with an unchanging view of ankles and advertisements. This post is my plan B, my Hail Mary, my long shot. I've spent lifetimes typing and posting this message in the hope that someone will read it and become convinced that my suffering must end. Someone on this platform right now. Someone who will find a man curled up under the bench, the man who crawled down the escalator, and kill him as swiftly as possible. A bullet to the temple. If you're armed at the Glenmont metro station, please shoot me. I would like to take this opportunity to thank any $10 and above patrons in order, of course. Dan R., Cody V., Paul Z., Chaos X, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, JY Pyromancer, Hayden MH, Ethan A., and Dark Side of the Bear. Guys, thank you so much for your support. If you would like access to Patreon-only content, go onto my Patreon and look because I updated the tiers. I think it's $30 or $20 will get you the ability to play a small bit part or a voice in my thing. So go over and check that out. Thank you.